Okay, we are starting on Chapter 10 now. These are the worksheets for Chapter 10 from the textbook. And just wanted to remind you again that all images that are included in these worksheets and the PowerPoint are in the public domain. And the images include links to the source in which they were taken from. A couple of things I wanted to point out in this PowerPoint, or in this homework assignment, is the embedded videos that we have. This one right here, let me see if I can pull this up. This one right here is a short video from the series on HBO, John Adams, and it has a short video about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. And then we also have another video here. This is from Discovery Channel, and Mike Rowe hosts a short little video clip here on history of alcohol in America, especially, and there's a nice little clip here about the Whiskey Rebellion. Hopefully those work for you, but they're YouTube clips, short clips. I encourage you to watch and give you a short. On the following couple of slides, I will point out a couple of hints, a couple of answers that are key as you work through this homework assignment. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to holler. Give me a email or a phone call. As we look at the first question here, how many full-fledged department heads were in Washington's cabinet? And the answer to that question is on page 181, and we have 3 full-fledged department heads: Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War Henry Knox. But I also wanted to take the time to call your attention to the chart that is on page 182, and I have kind of a different chart here, but this is the current cabinet minus the most recent addition, Secretary of Homeland Security, which was added in 2002 after 9/11. But we, of course, have the original Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State. Secretary of War no longer exists. It is now called Secretary of Defense, who has changed, but the Attorney General. So these are the big 4 today. These are important. These are the cabinet positions in order of creation. This then also becomes the line of succession in presidential order, later covered with an amendment to the Constitution. Now, one of the things that Chapter 10 focuses on is the national debt. This national debt was incurred during the Revolutionary War. We needed to pay for the Revolutionary War. We owed a lot of money to France and other nations. So if you look at number 9, according to Secretary of the Treasury now, Hamilton is thinking that assuming the national debt would chain the states more tightly to, in this case, the federal chariot. Okay, this is number 9. And so if we look here, the Secretary of State made a convincing argument, a convincing case that the state's debts could be regarded as proper national obligations. So the state's debts are to foreign nations and also to their own citizens. They had been incurred during the war, the Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, but foremost in Hamilton's thinking was the belief that assumption would chain the states more tightly to the federal chariot. So the states would then in some ways be indebted to the national government because the national government had assumed their debt. It's kind of a difficult economic kind of concept, but Hamilton was definitely a financial genius and the father of the First National Bank. This paragraph here can be found at the bottom of page 183. So then as we turn to page 184, the second full paragraph on page 184. I want you to look at this, and the second paragraph on page 184 has the answers to questions number 11 and 12. So the questions about the national debt of 75 million, Hamilton assumed this national debt to the national new government, and why did Hamilton believe that within limits a national debt was a national blessing? So questions 11 and 12. Let's look at the second full paragraph on page 184. And the answers here. Hamilton is considered this father of the national debt. And Hamilton was not greatly worried about this national debt. His objectives were as much political as economic. He believed that within limits, that's the key, within limits, a national debt was a national blessing, a kind of union adhesive. So the national debt keeps us all together. The more creditors to whom the government owed money, the more people there would be with a personal stake in the success of this ambitious enterprise. So in other words, especially if American citizens, U.S. citizens, were in fact invested, so if the government owed our citizens money, then our citizens would have a personal stake in the success of our country, and our country was considered an ambitious enterprise. Some might think the same strategy is considered today. If we are in debt even to foreign nations today, within reason, if we're in debt to foreign nations maybe have a personal stake in the success of the U.S. If we are in debt to China, if we are in debt to foreign investment, foreign investors have a personal stake in our success. Most would probably argue today that the debt that we have today is maybe not within limits, but that's a different discussion. In addition, take time to look at this short video. If the link doesn't work, just look up on YouTube Hamilton and Jefferson and their debate about the national bank. It's in this HBO series from John Adams, but it's about a 5-6 minute clip, and it's kind of an interesting characterization of the arguments between Hamilton and Jefferson. Now, it's worthwhile to note that Jefferson was probably the most vehemently was the founding father that was most vehemently against the founding of the national bank. He did not like debt, which was kind of ironic since he himself was financially bankrupt and was in deep debt. But we'll talk about that later. So take a look here at questions 17 and 18. So, who did the following opinions belong to? And also question number 18, 17 and 18. So turn in your books, I believe it's on page 185, first full paragraph. And the answers here. Hamilton also, at Washington's request, prepared a brilliantly reasoned reply to Jefferson's arguments. Now, these are Jefferson's arguments against the national bank. Hamilton, in general, believed that what the Constitution did not forbid, it permitted. Jefferson, in contrast, believed that what it did not permit, it forbade. And this is a fundamental argument that kind of creates the first two political parties. So hopefully you can understand that Hamilton believed in a strong central government, and if the Constitution doesn't mention anything, then if the Constitution doesn't mention anything about a national bank, then the national bank is permitted. But Jefferson was in contrast and did not trust a strong central national government and did not want the bank. So Jefferson's opinion, he believed that if the national bank is not mentioned in the Constitution, then it cannot happen. So later on, then, this leads to this necessary and proper argument, and it has to do with Section 8 of the Constitution and Clause 18, in which this necessary and proper clause of the Constitution is debated. Was the bank necessary and proper? Is the national bank necessary and proper? Or, if you take a strict interpretation of the Constitution, is it not necessary and proper? So this loose or broad interpretation of the Constitution is something that basically leads to the Federalist Party, a strong central government, or an anti-Federalist Party, a weak central government. And in addition, then, we're talking about here later on the Whiskey Rebellion. And so this short little video clip here on Discovery Channel and on YouTube is about the Whiskey Rebellion, and it's worth watching. On to the next page here. Wanted to call your attention to the election then of 1796, questions 38 and 39. In this election, George Washington gives his farewell address. George Washington starts this practice of this tradition of only serving 2 terms. He voluntarily steps down from the office, leading to an open election. Jefferson is interested in maybe becoming president. John Adams is interested in becoming president. John Adams was George Washington's vice president. And so the Jeffersonians, it's interesting to note that, or it's important to note that politicians during this time did not actively campaign, but sometimes they had other people voice their opinions for them. So as this campaign starts, the anti-Federalists, or the Jeffersonians, they had maybe 2 things that they focused on. The Jeffersonians were critical of the too forceful crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion by Washington, and then kind of guilty by association, John Adams. So the crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion and John Jay's, or just the treaty, Jay's treaty. So those were the 2 negative things that the Jeffersonians focused on. The election results, the Electoral College results, we have 71 to 68. It's a very close election. Interesting to note that we have then a second place winner. The runner-up, Jefferson, becomes the vice president. So John Adams wins. Whoever gets second place becomes vice president. And so we know this is going to present all kinds of problems. Can't imagine that happening today. Bitter political rivalries, then having to work together. These are the electoral results. Those are the states. So those are the things to focus on questions 38 and 39. Also have a nickname here for then John Adams, his rotundity. He was a little bit chubby, heavier set, and this has to do with kind of John Adams' insistence upon calling George Washington, when he was president, His Excellency. And Washington refused this and insisted upon being called just the president. And so when John Adams became president, they kind of mocked him a little bit and called him his rotundity. As you continue in Chapter 10, it also calls attention to the Xyz Affair and our relations with France. The Xyz Affair has to do with 3 ambassadors, 3 foreign policy people in France, the 3 go-betweeners, later referred to as X, Y, and Z. These French spokesmen, and they were asking for basically money, cash, $250,000 for the privilege of merely talking to the French Talleyrand. So read about that on page 194 and 195, and then so the answer to number 45, and we talk about millions for defense. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And that paragraph is on page 195. So as a result of this conflict that is existing between the United States and France, it leads to some possible war talk between the United States and France, and then this leads to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and their disputes. And so as Adams is receiving lots of criticism, President Adams is receiving lots of criticisms, especially from the Anti-Federalists, led kind of secretly by Jefferson. You have questions 48, 49 in particular, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the lion Matthew, the spitting lion, is sentenced 4 months in jail for not much compared to today's talk in politics. So this, I wanted to call your attention to the bottom of page 196. See if I can find it here. So the spitting lion, who earlier gained fame by spitting in the face of a Federalist, was sentenced to 4 months in jail for writing that Adams had an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. Fairly minor criticism, and he received jail sentence for this, and of course that's going to outrage Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists. And then another culprit was lucky to only have a $100 fine, after he expressed, I think this is kind of funny, expressed the wish that the wad of a cannon fired in honor of Adams had landed in the seat of his breeches. So read through the Alien and Sedition Act, those couple of paragraphs, the Lockjaw Sedition Act, see what you think. I might have a discussion question on that later on. Lastly, I wanted to take a look at this last question, number 54, bundle of Jefferson's inconsistencies, and this is briefly talked about on page 199. The liberal thinking Jefferson had this bundle of inconsistencies, and the one that they call attention to is this: he was a traitor of the upper class. He himself lived in this imposing hilltop mansion in Monticello, and yet he cherished the uncommon sympathy for the common people. So he was very wealthy, but he was liberal thinking, and he really felt like he was the champion of the cause of the downtrodden. That's one inconsistency. Now, the book kind of mentions a couple others. I wanted to just highlight them. Jefferson was a slave owner, and yet he was the author of the phrase, "All men are created equal." Jefferson was vehemently opposed to the national bank and the national debt, yet he himself was bankrupt and highly in debt. So the inconsistencies, the dichotomies of Jefferson, the person, there are numerous examples of them. The last one is Jefferson's very strict interpretation of the Constitution, and when Jefferson becomes president, he purchases Louisiana, and there is no power given to the president in the Constitution allowing him to do that, so he kind of uses a loose interpretation of the Constitution and what is necessary and proper, and this kind of goes against one of the fundamental beliefs that he has about the Constitution. So 3 or 4 major inconsistencies exist, a bundle of inconsistencies exist within Jefferson's personality. That concludes my suggestions and hints for Chapter 10 questions. Don't hesitate to email if you have any questions.